Hello and welcome to Drunk on Tea. Today I'm going to show you how to paint these tiny marines in the style of the Death Guard for your games of Legions Imperialis. Now the first thing I've done is I've stuck these models onto a bit of spare sprue so they're much easier to handle, and I've primed the models white. And first of all, I'm coming in with some Rawk flesh, and with this I'm going to paint all of the power armour to the models. Now obviously these models are so small that you don't want to obscure any of the detail that's moulded into these models. So I'm going to come in a few thin layers to slowly build up to a solid coat of Rawk flesh all over the power armour. By having these models stuck to this sprue, it's allowing me to reach all the way around the models to coat all of that power armour with a couple of layers of Rawk flesh. It's much easier than if I was working with them already attached to the base. You don't need to worry about being too neat at this stage. You can get Rawk flesh over any other parts of the model, but just ensure in a couple thin layers you build up to a solid coat of Rawk flesh all over the power armour to these models. I'm going to be painting these in the Horus Heresy style of Death Guard, so that's why I'm using the Rawk flesh here. They have a much more interesting colour pattern than just the pure Death Guard green that you get on the modern 40k Death Guard. So just take your time at this step and ensure you coat all of that power armour with a couple of layers of Rawk flesh. As you can see here, some of these models have some weird undercuts in the sculpting. Unfortunately, that is just a part of the models at this scale. I've tried to clear up as much of it as I can, but you will always get some weird artifacting around the hands and the legs on a lot of these sculpts. That's just how they come off the sprues. And after a couple of layers of Rawk flesh, you can see I've built up to that solid base coat all over the power armour. So the next thing is I'm going to pick out the shoulder pads on these models. For this I will be coming in with some Death Guard green and using a very small brush, just going to make sure I pick out those shoulder pads on all of these models. So I'm being really careful around the Rawk flesh we've already painted, and in a couple of layers I'm going to pick out all of the shoulder pads with a couple of layers of Death Guard green. Because of the pattern of power armour these models are in, you can see they've got the spiky shoulder pad on the left side. At this stage I'm just coating all of that with Death Guard green. Later on we'll come in and pick out those studs with some silver. But for now, just pick out all of the shoulder pads with a couple of layers of Death Guard green, being nice and careful around the Rawk flesh we've already painted. So when working with smaller models like this, the secret really is to up the contrast on your colours so they stand out, because we don't have nearly as much detail to work with as when I'm working with a full-size Space Marine. So I'm going to use colour to really make the detail stand out on these models. So that's why I'm using quite a light green here, so that these shoulder pads will stand out on the battlefield against a lot of the darker colours on the rest of the model. And after a couple of layers of Death Guard green, you can see we've picked out those shoulder pads. They're looking nice and bright on the model. So the next step will be painting any of the black details on these miniatures. And for that I'll be using Corvus Black. So I'm going to very carefully pick out all of the details on the weapon. I'm going to pick out the case, the chainsword at the front, and any of the magazine housing and details like that. I'm going to make sure I pick all of this out with a couple of layers of Corvus Black, being really careful around all of the Rawk flesh we've already painted. We don't want to get any of this over the power armour we've already painted up. I'm just going to carefully pick out all of the details on the weapons with a couple of layers of Corvus Black. This is where you really want to make sure that you don't need any of the white primer shown between the Rawk flesh and the gun casing. Just ensure you catch all of this with some Corvus Black. Also, we are dealing with some very small details here, so really take your time and be nice and careful when you're picking out these details on the guns. And at this stage as well, I'm also going to pick out the pistol holster on their legs. Find this little raised detail here. I'm just picking this out with a couple of coats of Corvus Black as well. This will break up that power armour and add a little bit of interest to the lower half of these models. And with all of those black details picked out, you can see it's really added interest and detail to the models. So now there's just one last base coat left to apply to these Marines. And that will be with some lead belcher. I'm going to pick out any of the metallic details. So that's going to be areas here like the magazine at the bottom of the gun. I'm also going to pick out the little bit of the chainsaw blade and the tips of their chainsaw on their weapons, and any vents on the back of their backpack. I'm going to pick these out with lead belcher as well. And of course at this step I'm also going to pick out those studs on their left shoulder pads, being really careful, using a really small brush and just using the very tip of the brush to apply these details. Just going to pick out these little areas of metal with some lead belcher. You can see we are dealing with some very small details here, so just pick out what you can with some lead belcher, break up that black colour and add some more interest and detail to these tiny Space Marines. I'm picking out those studs and just very carefully putting a little bit of lead belcher onto the top of each of the studs on the shoulder pad. And with that lead belcher applied, we've had a little bit more interest to these tiny models. Now the next step is I'm going to apply an all over shade to these Marines. So for this I'm using some Mortarian grime. I'm going to thin down with a little bit of water so it's not too harsh, and then I'm just going to shade this all over the models. So this will add some interest to all of the details: the Death Guard green, the Rawk flesh, the lead belcher, and it'll even sink into the recesses on the Corvus Black as well, and add some definition all over these little Marines. Now at this scale you really want to make sure that the shade isn't pooling on the models. So as it's drying, keep wicking away any areas where it's pooling too heavily with a dry brush, so it just sinks into all of those recesses, does the job of panel lining all of the power armour, and will add definition on these tiny, tiny epic scale Space Marines. You can see here between the legs of one of these I've got a little bit of pooling coming in, so after I've shaded the rest of these models I'm going to come in with a dry brush and wick that pooling away, so I end up with a nice crisp shade all over the Space Marines. If you're enjoying the video, please press like. If you want more videos, press the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. If you would like to support the channel and become a member, please press the join button down below. And after that shader's dried, you can see it's added definition all over the Space Marines, sunk into all of those recesses, and really made that power armor pop out at a tiny scale. So now with some Deepkin flesh, I'm going to do some tiny edge highlights onto the power armor. So using my smallest brush, wherever I've got any sharp lines, I'm coming in and just catching the most raised details with a tiny edge highlight of Deepkin flesh. You don't need to apply this to every single panel on the Space Marine, but pick out some of the most raised details sculpted into them, next to where the shade has settled, and apply a thin edge highlight of Deepkin flesh onto all of the most raised details on the Space Marine. This step will really add some interest at this small scale to these models, brighten up parts of those armour, and give it the effect of light hitting at a small scale. But keep these highlights really small, as thin as you can, and just apply them on the most top facing edges and details on all of the models, and just pick some of these sharpest details out with a really thin edge highlight of Deepkin flesh. So I'm doing things like around the leg trim on the power armor, sharp details on the backpack, and really any solidly straight lines. I'm just picking these out with a tiny edge highlight of Deepkin flesh. Really take your time at this step and just pick out some of these details with a really sharp thin line of Deepkin flesh to add some interest to these models. But a lot of people won't bother edge highlighting at this scale, but I feel that these small edge highlights will really make a difference to your models, really make them stand out on a tabletop. And with that little bit of Deepkin flesh applied, you can see it's made that power armor stand out a little bit more. And now with some Ogryn camo, I'm going to come in and edge highlight the shoulder pads. So much like with the power armor, I'm just applying a really thin edge highlight of Ogryn camo on the sharpest points of the shoulder pads. So it's going to be down the bottom of each one. And on some of them where you've got a sharp line on the side, I'm going to catch that with some Ogryn camo as well. But once again, keep these really small, really fine, and just apply a thin edge highlight of Ogryn camo to any of the areas that we've painted with Death Guard green. On these ones with the studs, be really careful around the lead belcher details, but just catch that bottom edge with a thin edge highlight of Ogryn camo. With the Ogryn camo applied, it's made those shoulder pads stand out from the rest of the model. And now there's just one final highlight to apply to these Marines, and that's going to be with some Dawnstone. I'm going to apply a small highlight to all of the areas we painted with Corvus Black. So I'm going to pick out these sharp details on the gun, sharp edges, raised details, anything like that. I'm just catching with a really small, thin highlight of Dawnstone, just to break up that black and add some interest to the weapons. Once again, take your time at this stage, make sure these lines are really small, really fine, just catching the most raised and prominent details on the weapons. I'm also going to apply a small edge highlight around the sharpest points of the pistol holster, just catching that very sharp edge with a thin edge highlight of Dawnstone. And with that Dawnstone applied, that is all of the highlights applied to our Marines. So now the next step is I'm going to paint up the base. So you see I've got the base stuck onto one of my painting handles and I primed it white. And first of all I'm coming in with some Mechanica Standard Grey. I'm going to paint this all over the base. So it's going to take a couple of coats to get a solid colour all over the base. You'll make sure I work it into all of the recesses, but just make sure you paint all of that base with a couple of layers of Mechanica Standard Grey. This will give us a really nice base coat to get a really good urban effect on these bases. As you can see, I thinned my Mechanica Standard Grey down so it's nice and smooth. Will sink into all of those recesses and give me a solid coat of Mechanica Standard Grey all over the base. After the first coat, it's still very patchy coverage, so I'm coming back in with a second layer of Mechanica Standard Grey, building up till I get a solid coat all over the top of the base. And after a couple of layers of Mechanica Standard Grey, got a solid coat all over the top of the base. So the next step is with some Nuln Oil, I'm going to shade all over the base. I'm going to let this sink into all of the recesses as well as settle slightly on the top. You don't want it to pull too heavily on any of the flat surfaces. Just make sure you shade all of the base with some Nuln Oil. And once that Nuln Oil is dried, you can see it's darkened down areas of the Mechanica Standard Grey, giving a good urban look. So now with some Dawnstone, I'm going to treat this like a dry brush. So I'm drying my brush off, so it's not got much paint on it. But rather than swiping it across the base, I'm going to stipple it over the base, just to add some interest and kind of concrete texture to the flat areas of the base. You can do this in a couple of passes, slowly build up by stippling some spots of Dawnstone all over the top of the base. With the Dawnstone applied, we've got a nice textured pattern all over the top of the base. So now with some Scrag Brown and Larmian Medium, in about 1 part Scrag Brown to 3 parts Larmian Medium. So this is nice and thin. I'm going to run this into the recesses of the base. This will give a really dirty look to all of these recesses. So I'm just going to apply this into all of the lines and all of the holes of the base. I'm just applying a bit of this mix. And I'm ensuring it doesn't pull too heavily. If I see it pooling anywhere, I'm wicking it away with a dry brush. So I'm just leaving a little bit into all of those recesses of the base. I'm just tracing it into every recess, every line on the base, applying a bit of this thinned down Scrag Brown mixture. It will flow really easily because of the Larmian Medium, and when it dries it will give us a really nice effect on all of these recesses. I'll make sure I sink it into all of these holes so it just settles and darkens them down a little bit. I'm also going to apply this into some of the cracks on the top half of the base, but rather than trace it all the way through the lines, I'm just going to apply it in little bits. So I'm going to leave some of that Nuln Oil showing in some recesses, and in other parts I'm going to trace in a bit of this thinned down Scrag Brown, so we'll get a couple of different colours and tones on the base and really add some interest. And once that Scrag Brown's applied, you can see it's really given a dirty look to all the cracks and recesses on the base. So the next step is to tidy up the rim. For this I'm coming in with some Abaddon Black. I'm just going to carefully apply this around the rim of the base in a couple of layers until I got a solid coat of Abaddon Black going all the way around the rim. So you can do the rim any colour you like. I just really like the look of black rims on my bases. So be really careful, try not to get this over any of the top if you can help it. Work your way around the rim of the base, applying a couple of layers of Abaddon Black until we've got a solid coat of black around the rim of the base. After a couple of coats of Abaddon Black, you can see we've got a solid coat and that base is looking really nice. So all that's left to do now is to attach your little tiny Space Marines to the top of the base. And that is how to paint Death Guard Space Marines in an epic scale for your games of Legions Imperialis. You can use this same scheme for painting the Dreadnoughts and other vehicles for the game as well. You just place the same colours using the same method in different areas of the models. But thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please let me know in the comments down below, are there any other Legions that you would like to see me paint models of in this epic scale? But thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and happy painting!